I used to hitchhike everywhere. I loved the freedom, the open road, never knowing where I'd end up. But after that night, I can't even look at the side of a highway without my stomach turning. I can't get the image out of my head. The car, the driver, that thing I saw in the rear view mirror. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, when I found myself stranded on a long stretch of desert highway. I'd been walking for hours, but I hadn't seen a single car. The silence was unsettling. No animals, no wind, just me and my own footsteps echoing in the dark. And then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared behind me. I turned, relief flooding over me, and held out my thumb. The car, an old black sedan, slowed down and pulled over. The driver leaned over, his face obscured in shadows, and asked if I needed a lift. His voice was low, almost too quiet, but I was desperate. I climbed into the passenger seat, barely catching a glimpse of his face. He had this strange look, hollow eyes, skin too pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. But he barely spoke, just nodded and started driving, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. For a while, we just sat in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. I tried to make small talk, but he didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, unblinking. That's when I noticed the smell. Something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers, or maybe something worse. I rolled down the window a little, trying not to gag. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. Someone. No, something was sitting in the back seat. It was hunched over, its face obscured, but I could see its long, bony fingers wrapped around the seat, almost touching my shoulder. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked the driver, "Hey, is someone else back there?" The driver didn't respond. He just kept driving, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wheel tighter. I turned back around, my heart pounding, and that's when I noticed that the thing in the back seat wasn't sitting still. It was swaying, almost like it was breathing. I could hear this faint, wheezing sound, like it was struggling to pull in each breath. I tried to stay calm, but every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out. I glanced at the door handle, thinking maybe I could jump out, but we were speeding down the highway now, no sign of stopping. Finally, I forced myself to look back in the rearview mirror, and this time, it looked up. I'll never forget its face. Sunken eyes, hollow and black, staring straight into mine. Its mouth hung open, unnaturally wide, as if it was silently screaming. And then it smiled, this twisted, awful smile that spread way too far across its face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I snapped my gaze back to the road, and that's when the driver spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. He said, "You can see her, can't you?" I couldn't answer. My voice was gone, frozen in my throat. He just nodded like he knew, and said, "She only appears for those who are lost, those who don't belong." Suddenly, the car began to slow down, pulling off onto the side of the road. The driver looked at me, his pale, hollow eyes meeting mine. "Get out," he said, his voice like gravel. I didn't argue. I stumbled out, barely able to breathe, and watched as he drove away, the figure in the back seat still staring at me, her mouth stretched into that horrible silent scream. I stood there for hours, unable to move, until the first light of dawn appeared. I never saw that car again, and now whenever I'm out on the road alone at night, I feel her, watching, waiting. I don't know what she wants, but I know she's still out there, looking for the next soul lost enough to see her. I wasn't supposed to be out there that night. Hitchhiking was always something I did during the day, but when my car broke down miles from home with no signal, I figured one ride couldn't hurt. But looking back, I should have just walked. It was around 1 a.m. when a pickup truck finally pulled over. The driver leaned out, an older man, grizzled and silent. His face was shadowed under his hat, and he only gave a slight nod when I asked if he was headed toward town. I figured no harm done, just a quick lift down the road. I climbed into the truck, buckling up. The inside was worn down, covered in dust and smelling faintly of something metallic. We drove in silence, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on pavement the only sounds. Every now and then, I'd glance at the man, trying to get a read on him. But he never looked over, just stared straight ahead. I could only see his eyes in the rearview mirror, but they were strange, unfocused, like he was looking right through me. About 20 minutes into the ride, I noticed something odd. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shape in the back of the truck, barely visible in the side mirror. It looked like a bundle, wrapped tightly in old canvas, lying still in the bed of the truck. I tried to dismiss it as some equipment, or maybe a tarp, but every so often, I'd swear I saw it shift, like something was moving beneath. Then, suddenly the man spoke, his voice a dry rasp, as if he hadn't spoken in years. He said, "I wouldn't worry too much about the back." It felt like a warning. I didn't respond, but a chill ran down my spine. I kept telling myself just a bit longer, just stay calm. Minutes later, I glanced at the dashboard and noticed something that made my blood run cold. The clock, it hadn't changed since I got in the truck. It was stuck at 1:13 a.m. We'd been driving for at least a half hour, but it was as if time hadn't moved. At that moment, I glanced back at the side mirror, and the canvas bundle in the truck bed wasn't there anymore. My heart skipped. I looked back, trying to see if it had fallen out, but the bed was empty. Just empty. The man's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles pale as he murmured, "They don't like it when you notice them." I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the door handle, ready to jump out, but the handle wouldn't budge. I was trapped. That's when I saw the bundle. No, not a bundle. A figure, crouched and half hidden behind my seat, its face inches from mine in the rearview mirror. Its eyes were hollow, and it was grinning, lips stretched wide in a way no human face could manage. The thing leaned close, and in a voice that wasn't my own, it whispered, "I was lost once too, but he found me." My blood turned to ice. I looked back at the driver, my heart pounding, and for the first time he turned toward me. His eyes were dark, lifeless pits, and he just smiled. The truck slowed to a stop, in the middle of nowhere, the headlights casting eerie shadows across the empty road. The driver looked at me as if waiting. I stumbled out of the truck, my hands shaking, and started running without looking back. I could feel eyes on me, feel the weight of something watching me from the truck. To this day, I don't know what that thing was, or who or what the driver really was. But every so often, when I drive that stretch of highway at night, I see headlights in the distance and hear a voice whisper, "Need a lift." It was the kind of night that seemed to trap every sound and turn every mile of road into an echo chamber. The moon hung low and distorted behind thick clouds, like a bloated eye watching the interstate. I'd been driving for hours, staring into that empty stretch of two-lane highway. My radio had faded out of range, and in its place came a low, rhythmic buzzing. That's when I saw him. A lone figure standing just beyond the reach of my high beams. His outline was hazy, as if he were shifting somehow, like he was caught between one reality and another. I should have just kept going, but fatigue and some twisted sense of curiosity got the better of me. I slowed down, letting the car crawl forward. I cracked the window and called out, "Need a ride?" No response. He just stood there, silent and still. I felt an odd chill skitter up my spine, but before I could think it over, he nodded, almost mechanically. He opened the door without a sound and slid in. He didn't make a move to buckle his seatbelt, and I could feel him staring at me, even though I hadn't dared to look at him directly. "Where you headed?" I asked, breaking the silence. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering the question. Then he spoke, and his voice was something strange, raspy and cold, as if it came from a mouth that hadn't been used to speak in a very long time. "Just a bit further up the road," he replied. I nodded and pressed on the gas, glad to have a direction at least. His words were like nails scraping against metal, a grating sound that somehow resonated in the back of my skull. He didn't say much after that. Occasionally I'd catch him watching me, but every time I glanced over, he would turn his gaze back to the road. And then, maybe 10 minutes in, he broke the silence again. "Do you know the area?" "Not really," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just passing through." "Have you ever felt that sensation," he asked slowly, "of being pulled towards something?" I hesitated. "Like a place?" "No. Like a memory," he whispered, his voice curling around the words like smoke. "A memory that's not yours." My hands tightened on the wheel and I forced a laugh. "Can't say I have. That's something you experience a lot." He nodded slowly, his face still shadowed. "Yes, I suppose you could say that, but it's less of an experience and more of an awakening." His words sent a prickling down my neck. I tried to brush it off, but the air in the car had turned thick and oppressive. It was hard to breathe, as if the very air was infected by his words. Then, out of nowhere, he started muttering to himself, speaking in some language I didn't recognize. It was guttural, heavy, like the sound of stones grinding together. Every so often he'd stop, a long silence stretching between his whispers. And each time he paused, the radio's buzzing would grow louder, filling the car with that strange static. I glanced at him, and I swear his skin looked wrong, pale, almost translucent, with dark veins twisting beneath the surface. I could have sworn he hadn't looked like that when he got in, but then again, I hadn't looked directly at him. Now it felt impossible to look away. "You know," he said, and his voice cut through the static like a knife, "we're all just vessels, carrying the past. Sometimes the past finds its way back. Sometimes it tries to relive itself." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just drove, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The buzzing in the radio was now more than just a sound, it was vibrating through my bones. It felt like something was crawling inside my head, filling my thoughts with static. The figure shifted beside me, moving closer. His eyes glinted with something that looked like recognition, as if he knew me. Not the way you know a friend, but as if he was familiar with every dark thought, every hidden fear I'd ever had. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked. "The memory that isn't yours. The echo." "What? What do you mean?" I managed to stammer. He leaned in close, his breath cold against my neck. "You've been here before," he said, his voice almost a growl. "In another life. You know what comes next." A flash of something stirred in my mind, a road. This road stretching endlessly under a sky just like this one, in a car that wasn't quite my own, and a passenger, a stranger in the seat beside me. "You know what happens when you reach the end of this road," he whispered. A creeping sense of terror gripped me. I tried to focus, but the memory twisted and blurred, as if I were peering through a fog. I was driving, always driving, with him beside me. And each time I reached the end of the road, something terrible happened, something I couldn't quite remember, yet it haunted me like a forgotten nightmare. I could barely see the road anymore, the static now blinding me. My hands were no longer my own, I could feel him guiding them, pulling me forward deeper into the memory. "What are you?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. His lips curved into a smile, a hollow, empty thing. "I am you," he said, And I am everyone who has ever driven this road. I am the last passenger, the memory that never fades. I looked over, and his face had shifted again, taking on the shape of something familiar, something horrifyingly familiar. It was my face, twisted and worn, staring back at me with eyes that held centuries of pain. As I looked into those eyes, a dark realization washed over me. This wasn't just a hitchhiker. This was me, a part of me, or maybe a part of every driver who had ever passed this way. A piece of the road itself, haunting every soul who dared to drive it alone at night. In the split second that followed, the car spun off the road, tires skidding against gravel. I braced myself, expecting impact, but instead, the world went silent, like the pause before a final breath. When I opened my eyes, I was alone on the highway, my car still idling. I looked over, but the passenger seat was empty, as if he had never been there. But I knew. Deep down, I knew he was still there, somewhere waiting. The radio buzzed to life again, filling the car with that familiar static. And as I pulled back onto the road, I knew that one day on another night, I'd see him again.